Good day, folks. This is your defense update for the 26th. It is Tuesday, and we're not talking peachy today, mostly because Peachy's stupid at this point. Even the Democrats are realizing that it's a loser with the electorate. And if they keep this crap up, they're likely to find themselves electing Donald Trump in about another year for a second term. So I have a suspicion that this is, things are going to change a little bit here. No, I want to talk about this whole Russia-Ukraine situation. And I just want to prompt you to do some investigation on your own, because I'm not going to lay all this out. I could sit here for an hour and talk about this. All right. But I shouldn't. You should do the work, because if you don't, first off, half you won't believe me. And those of you that do will just become rabid sycophants that are, Denninger says. No, you shouldn't listen to what Denninger says. You should do your own research on this. I'm just going to point out a few basic facts. Number one, Russia has a GDP 1/8 of the United States, approximately. 8% of the United States, approximately. And spends about $60 billion a year on defense. The United States spends over $700 billion a year on defense. Russia has exactly 0 large nuclear carrier groups. They have fewer combat-ready aircraft than we have. They have some pretty good ones, but they have fewer than we have. They have no ability to project power across oceans, actually land in the United States and take it over. Absolutely none. They possess, of course, a lot of nuclear weapons, and so do we. And were they to use them against the United States, it would be suicide. They know this. Of course, if we were to use them against them, it would be suicide because they would launch too. This is the whole mutually assured destruction thing. We'd blow each other up. All right. What they do have is a lot of tanks and some very good ones. And they're also resource rich, which I will get to in a minute. The Ukraine, again, the Russian deep water naval port at Sevastopol has been Russian for longer than San Diego has been the United States' 12-month deep water naval port. Think about that for a minute. We, under Barack Obama, went into the Ukraine politically, under cover of darkness, if you will, through the CIA and other machinations, which ought to be damned well illegal, and people should have gone to prison for it forever, because we violated the very rules that we claim that other people should not break, specifically interfering in our political process, directly and indirectly, dangling membership in NATO for Ukraine. We essentially overthrew their government, and, boy, then all this bad stuff happened. Well, Russia had an actual lease on their deepwater naval port, and if you bother to take more than about 30 seconds worth of time and look at the history of Ukraine and where the ethnic and language makeup of the people that live there are, you would find that there are 2 very large areas that are essentially Russia, even though they're technically not. One would be the eastern part of the country, which is full of Russians, people who consider themselves Russian. They speak Russian. And then, on top of that, you have Crimea, which, by the way, after all of this BS started, they held a referendum, and essentially everybody there wanted to affiliate with Russia. Well, gee, that's a big shock. And I know, it was one of Putin's rigged elections. Well, actually, probably not. Again, take a look at the ethnic makeup of the people who live there and just what language they speak, where they come from, what language they speak. How would you think they would ethnically identify themselves, and what sort of national identity do you think they have? Do remember that the USSR and all the stuff under the czars and Stalin and Lenin, all of this was a conglomeration of, in many cases, what are now separate countries. And they were before. Do note that Ukraine has been, it's a nice-sized country now, but you know what? It was carved up into a bunch of other little things. So there were pieces that went on and pieces that came off. This is hardly we're one big happy family and one big stable map, and it's always been that way. I don't think so. If you really want to know how these ties all originally went together, why don't you just take a quick look at the map and where the roads go? And just look at the stuff coming out of Moscow and where it goes. Do I need to go any further? I don't think so. Now, is Putin potentially a problem? Of course, anybody's potentially a problem. But we have all these countries over there that are independent nations now, right? Lithuania, Poland, Ukraine, Romania, Hungary, Austria. Heck, if you want to get into it, how about Germany? Berlin isn't all that far, right? There was this little issue between Berlin and Moscow at one point. I think there was an attempt for armies from one to go into the other, right? Didn't work out so good for them. But, there was this thing about winter that got in the way. And then they got driven back the other direction. But all of these nations over there, yes, Russia has a lot of tanks. They have very good tanks. They have no deep water naval capability. They could never invade the United States. They could nuke us to ash and we could nuke them. But that's about it. All right, so if all these countries are all so worried about all this terrible stuff that Putin could do, may I ask a question? Why aren't they spending all of their own money? Remember, the entirety of Russia spent $60 billion. You're telling me that between all of these nations over there that allegedly have this grand interest, they couldn't come up with an equally cogent defense strategy and that amount of money. Really? Are you absolutely sure about that? Because Germany in 2019 spent $49 billion all on their own. Well, that's within a spitting distance of 60, isn't it? So how much more would you have to come up with in there? Yeah, I know. We're the policemen of the world, and it's our problem. While we're busy jacking ourselves off with this, we're ignoring where the real problem is. Take a guess. That would be China. Yeah, that would be China. China flexing its actual military muscle, not, making a lot of noise and being smug and screwing very pretty gymnasts for their leader. Hey, listen, you got to give Putin some credit. You get yourself a girlfriend like that, I got nothing to complain about, and you shouldn't either. Put some of our leaders to shame, especially, old Bill. Yeah. Anyway. So China, on the other hand, is running real no bullshit Nazi-style concentration camps right now. Why? Because you pray the wrong way. And boy, oh boy, is that a threat to the Chinese hegemony, and therefore we are going to do this. All right? They are having their so-called freedom of navigation exercises, as are we. They are building artificial islands in the South China Sea, and they are threatening to squash people like bugs in Hong Kong, and every now and then they rattle their saber about doing the same thing in Taiwan. China, under our PNTR, our view that we should prop up this so-called developing country, has seen its GDP and its defense spending explode. And guess how much attention we pay to that? That would be a big fat zero while we're worried about Moscow. Maybe, just maybe, instead of worrying about Putin trying to get the band back together, which he doesn't have the ability to do even if he wanted to, and I'm not convinced he does, we ought to be worried about Xi and all the games that he's playing around the world and the damage he's doing and the destruction he's wreaking, and, by the way, the very real threat he poses. And anybody that thinks that threat's not real, boy, you have rocks in your head. May I point out that essentially the entire western part of Russia, and boy, oh boy, is that a big blankety blanking country. There is a lot of oil and gas there. And if you think that the Chinese wouldn't just love to come in there and boy, we're just going to take that, you'd be wrong. They would like to do it. Now, there is this little problem, which is that it's really tough to actually do things like that because, people have tried to invade Russia before and it hasn't ended very well for them. The weather tends to get in the way. But China has a god-awful number of people. And China is also a very large nation and has a huge defense budget and is building aircraft carriers, big ones, and is building airplanes, most of which they stole the designs from for us, and is building nuclear bombs, has a bunch of them, and, by the way, they stole the designs for those from us, too. And yet why aren't we talking about all kinds of problems with election interference there. Maybe because Hunter Biden got $1.5 billion of Chinese money, and that would mean you'd have to look at the Democrats. Really? You're worried about Putin? You know, don't get me wrong. Communists are communists. But Russia is less communist now than it has been in a very, very long time. Less autocratic, too. Besides, they have a demographic disaster on their hands and they drink a lot of vodka. The Chinese, on the other hand, they're real communists. Big time. And they really mean it. And they have empire-style aspirations. And they pollute the living blankety-blank out of the land, air, and water. And they're threatening to do a bunch of other things, all of them very military-ish. And you know what? And they actually have an economy and a defense budget. And if you're wondering how big that defense budget is, there is no exact figure. But last year, the estimate, 2019, the estimate is somewhere around $250 billion, $250 billion. May I point out that a couple of years ago it was 146. 2014, it was about 130. They're growing their defense spending at an obscene rate, approximately 7 or 8% a year, maybe more. And their GDP is large enough to support this, largely because we gave them PNTR, after which everything just exploded higher. This is a country that now has a $12 trillion in U.S. dollar terms GDP as of 2017. We don't have an accurate number for last year. We don't have an accurate number, obviously, for this year either. But I think it's probably reasonable to expect that it's somewhere around $14 trillion. Okay, which if you think about this, 14 trillion from 12 is a really large increase. Okay, we're sitting at about 20-ish. And we are the ones that enable all of this, along with all of the theft, along with the unbridled expansion of their aggression, their election interference, their theft of intellectual property, military secrets, and everything else. And it was when PNTR was granted and on a forward basis that all of this happened. You want to take a look at what happened in China? Do you realize that they crossed the $1 trillion threshold in 1998 in terms of GDP? We essentially made China. And we have sat back while these communists today run the current version of Nazi concentration camps with the Uyghurs. We allow them to essentially control countries and other nations. We allow them to put their so-called belt and road nonsense together, in which they are impoverishing and enslaving other nations with crazy debt deals, the goal of which, obviously, ultimately, is to take control of those facilities. And yet we are screaming Russia, 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 instead of dealing with the real problem and doing what can be done to cut this off. Why is it that it is so important to us? And you want to know what the answer is? Why we leave China alone right now? Because you got to have your Nikes. Nike has to have a soaring stock price, and all these other companies do too, including Apple, which is currently trading at $265 a share. And were we to cut this BS off and tell them, nope, there ain't going to be no more of that, all those firms and their stock prices would crash. And good and justly so, because these people, the belief that somehow these people would find democracy, find representative government, and move forward on a geopolitical and a social basis if we just were nice to them, has been proved to be a flat-out lie. We need to address the real issue and it is the communist red Chinese. And we'd better do something about it now, because if we have to fight them, we're not going to like it. But we're going to like it a lot more today than we'll like it in another 20 years. This is not a nation that's going to stop. This is not a nation that negotiates in good faith. And it is not a nation that you can make a quote-unquote deal with that actually works. It never has been, and it never shall be. And those of you that think that Trump is going to come up with some grandiose deal and by God it's going to be great, or if we throw Trump out of office in another year and things will just go back to the way they were, well, I hope you like speaking Chinese. And you know what? If you don't want to start making little funny characters on your paper when you write, and you don't want to be the persecuted one because you ain't got slanty eyes, well, then you better wake the blankety blank up, and you better do it now. That's where the problem is. All this deflection and nonsense coming out of the left and coming out of the Democrats with regards to Ukraine and Russia is just that. It's BS. The real problem is found to the south and the east, and we better wake up to it. I'm your ticker guy, and that's the facts.